Hi, everyone, and welcome to Expanding the Ecosystem of Support for Survivors in the U.S. My name is Mariam Durrani, and I am the Policy Director at the National Domestic Violence Hotline. To get started with a little housekeeping, we will be monitoring the chat today for your questions, and there is also a question and answer function that we will be using to answer questions at the end. We also have ASL interpretation available today, which you can see pinned to the side of the screen, and closed captioning available that you should be able to stream at the bottom of your screen. If you have any tech questions or issues, you can message our great staff member Jake at the attendee account, the panelist account, the hotline, and he can help you with anything that you need. So I just wanted to get started by telling you a little bit more about the hotline and what it is that we do. Next slide, please. So for 25 years, the hotline has provided critical life-saving support to survivors of intimate partner violence and their loved ones. We are the only national 24-hour domestic violence hotline, and our prevention project, Love is Respect, also offers services 24/7 to teens and young people. With each call, chat, and text, our advocates strive to shift power back to survivors, not only providing hope for safety, for a life free from violence and healing, but also tangible pathways to resources that they may not have access to otherwise. To date, we have answered more than 5.65 million calls, chats, and texts from survivors and their loved ones across the United States and its territories. In addition, we have advocated for policy change, forged lasting and meaningful partnerships, provided essential real-time data on the experience of survivors, and shifted our advocacy to best meet the evolving needs of survivors, their friends, their family, and even those who cause harm. Next slide, please. So we recently released our 2020 impact report. In 2020, we received 636,968 calls, chats, and texts. We experienced a 2.3 increase in contacts compared to what we received in 2019. And the demand for our services seems to continue to increase. This past year was the highest annual contact volume in our history since our inception in 1996. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about who contacted us in 2020. 71% of our contacts identified as victims or survivors, 13% identified as helpers, so friends and family, and 16% identify as other, and that usually includes those who cause harm, service providers, people inquiring about, healthy versus unhealthy relationships, all of those sorts of things. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we heard from advocates on the line, 96% of the contacts were experiencing some form of emotional or verbal abuse. 64% mentioned physical abuse, 27% economic and financial abuse, 17% digital abuse, and 12% sexual abuse. And many contacts, of course, include a variety and combination of those. Next slide, please. So what we hear on the lines every day, survivors need immediate and long-term financial resources. They need safe and affordable housing. They need pathways to safety that don't necessarily involve the police or traditional systems. There's a need for culturally specific, queer and trans inclusive and accessible resources and programs, legal advocacy and resources to keep children safe, access to affordable reproductive and healthcare resources, of course, strategies to prevent digital and technological abuse, and ways to get partners to stop causing harm. So from all of this, it is absolutely clear, one thing is clear, that survivors need money to stay safe and heal. And that's why we're so excited for you today to hear from our friends at the organization FreeFrom, who are on a mission to reframe intimate partner violence and reimagine what support for survivors should look like. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to them now, and I'm so excited for you to be here for this presentation today.
Hey everybody, so we're going to give it a second for the PowerPoint to come up. But thank you so much for welcoming us. This is expanding the ecosystem of support for survivors in the US. My name is Tania Ventura. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'll hand it over to my colleagues to introduce themselves. But before that, just wanted to give you some housekeeping items. If you have questions, please drop them into the Q&A so we don't miss them in the chat. And they'll be helping us moderate those. We do have quite a bit of content to get through, so we will probably leave questions for the end unless it's super urgent and relevant to the slide that we are on. So just a heads up, hopefully we're not going too fast, but if we are, please let us know and we can slow down. So like I said, my name is Tania Ventura. I am a survivor. I am the Director of Service Provider Engagement and Education at FreeFrom. And I came to this work because I grew up in a low-income Latinx, undocumented, mostly undocumented community where entrepreneurship was really one of the only ways that we could survive. I'm also a third-generation survivor, so I really saw an intersection between financial empowerment, entrepreneurship, and survivorship, and just how useful finances, but also having your own income can be when trying to break generational harm. And that is why I do the work that I do. So I'm going to hand it over to Em next.
Hi, everyone. Very happy to be here. My name is M. Jackson. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I'm the Director of Peer Engagement and Support at FreeFrom. I'm also a survivor, and I came into this work without really truly understanding my own survivorship until I was doing the work. And so one of the reasons that I remain in this work is because I see how important it is to have diverse voices that come from different backgrounds and even are really realizing their healing journey while interacting with the movement. Very excited to be able to talk with you all about what we're doing here at FreeFrom, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Amy.
Thanks, Em. Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Durrance. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the Director of Systems Change Initiatives at FreeFrom. And I really started my advocacy on behalf of survivors of intimate partner violence in earnest as a student attorney in my law school's domestic violence clinic. And it was through that experience that I very quickly learned that the traditional crisis-focused resources and support, like temporary restraining orders, which is what I was helping survivors obtain in court, were necessary but not sufficient, because we'd walk out of that courthouse, I'd have that TRO or a more permanent restraining order in my hand, give that to my survivor client, but then folks still needed a place to stay, a way to buy diapers and groceries and clothes for their kids. And I very quickly realized that these crisis resources, like I mentioned, was just not sufficient. So I joined FreeFrom because it was really the first organization that I encountered that was really prioritizing, acknowledging, and addressing these systemic financial issues that all of my clients had experienced. So yeah, just really excited to be here with y'all today.
Thanks, y'all. So we're going to switch our cameras to not distract folks. So whoever's speaking from the FreeFrom team will have their camera on, and hopefully that helps follow us a little bit better. Next slide, please. So before we get started, we're going to do a little grounding. So if you're sitting on a chair, if you're laying down on your bed, if you're standing, whatever feels comfortable for you, maybe do some little shoulder rolls, some neck rolls, and close your eyes if you want to. We're going to take a deep breath together. And you're going to do that a couple more times. And I want you to think about how your day has been. What do you want to leave behind in the next hour or so? What do you maybe want to come back to? And what do you want to get out of this session? So set an intention in your mind. If you're having a hard time being present, maybe try to move around, drink some water, look around. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes, come back to your laptop or your computer or your phone, and let's get going. a heads up that we will be talking about money, and money for some people can bring up challenging feelings. So if that is you and you are feeling feelings come up, please feel free to do whatever you need necessary to feel better and to feel more grounded. We will not take it badly if you sign off because content is getting too difficult for you. Completely okay. And we hope that you have a good experience here today. Next slide, please. So briefly, gonna talk about our agenda. We're gonna do an introduction to FreeFrom. We're gonna jump into then understanding the problem that we'll be talking about. We're gonna talk about what is ecosystem. You know, it's in the title and we don't maybe know what that means. We're gonna jump into building collective power through peer networks, then our safety fund and the implications beyond the research that we collected through that project, expanding the ecosystem through systems change, capacity building in the IPV movement, and then the Q&A. Next slide. So we're going to start with reflection questions, and we don't have a lot of time to share out answers out loud, but please feel free to respond to this in the chat box. So the question is, when you hear the phrase ecosystem of support for survivors, what comes to mind for you? When you hear or see the phrase ecosystem of support for survivors, what comes to mind for you? And feel free to put that in the chat box. So the chat box is separate than the Q&A. Okay, so, oh, we're seeing it in the Q&A. So wraparound support. Oh, it looks like chat box is locked for folks. So sorry about that. Good to know. So we'll just keep an eye on the Q&A. But wraparound support is what somebody mentioned. Thanks, y'all. And I don't know if we can unlock the chat box, but that would be great because we're going to have more questions. Okay, next slide. So FreeFrom's approach is that we envision a world where survivors have sustaining income, savings, and credit with which to build wealth and the resources to support individual, intergenerational, and community healing. To that end, we are taking a holistic approach using data, technology, peer-to-peer networks, training programs for IPV agencies, policy and advocacy, social enterprise models, and cross-sector solutions. So we're doing a lot is what this means. And if, yes, Missy, thank you so much. And if we can move to the next slide. Okay, so to learn a little bit about the problem, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 2 of trans people will experience gender-based violence in their lifetime. So the #1 obstacle to safety for survivors is financial insecurity. To give you an idea of how much it costs to experience violence, the CDC found that on average, it costs $104,000 in associated costs when you are a female survivor of domestic violence. So that's a lot of money, right? For some of us, that's a few years of salaries. And then 99% of survivors experience economic abuse as part of the domestic violence or IPV that they experience. So what this all means is that experiencing gender-based violence is financially devastating for most people. It's extremely expensive to recover, and therefore we really need to build financial solutions so that folks can heal themselves, their children, and their communities, and rebuild their lives. Next slide. What is economic abuse? So I'm sure some of you already know this, but quick review. It's pretty much any tactic that controls a survivor's ability to acquire, use, and maintain economic resources, thus threatening the survivor's potential for self-sufficiency by creating financial dependence on the harm doer. So it's really about control, and it can happen person to person. It can be an employer to an employee. It can be a government agency to a constituent, etc. So it doesn't just happen in the IPV space. It can really happen beyond that. Next slide. So let's talk about ecosystem of support. So thank you all who engaged in the chat/Q&A. And let's go to the next slide. Let's learn about what this means. So we've learned that economic harm and also IPV generally can be very isolating, and that going to an agency, an IPV agency where they have services, isn't necessarily always safe for folks. So most IPV services are crisis focused. So that means that if you're no longer in crisis, they might not be very helpful. Some folks do not want to be associated with an IPV agency or government entity for whatever reasons, right? People have different reasons why they don't want to be associated. And law enforcement has historically harmed survivors, especially those who are trans, Black, Indigenous, and or undocumented. So calling the police or agencies that work very closely with the police might not be a safe option for a lot of folks. What this all pretty much means is that we all have a role in creating a society that gives survivors opportunities for economic security and healing. And survivors need more access points to safety and long-term solutions, or what we call an ecosystem of support. Next slide. So what does this ecosystem look like? So to us, it really helps survivors build collective power. It's backed by research and data. So that means that we have research and data that supports the experiences that survivors are telling us that they're having. It holds every pillar of our society accountable. So that means that this is not only the responsibility of IPV agencies or IPV government entities, but also involves funders, governments, churches or places of worship, banks, employers, other nonprofits and community-based agencies that are maybe not IPV focused, but are still doing community engagement work, academic institutions, survivors, and harm doers. So that means that we all have a piece to play in ending violence. Next slide. So what are other entities or institutions that could be added to this ecosystem now that y'all see them? I think the chat is still not working. Hopefully it is, but if it's not, could y'all type it into the Q&A or the chat box? And while y'all do that, I will hand it over to M just to keep things moving along.
All right, and are we getting any responses to that last question in the chat box?
Someone said mental health and medical providers. That's a good one. Excellent. And insurance companies, right? Okay, well, y'all keep typing away and let's hand it over to them.
All right, thank you so much, Tanya. So now we're looking at building collective power, specifically through peer networks. Next slide, please. So what exactly is survivor collective power? What that looks like to us is building a survivor-led movement. And what that means is really making sure that survivors are in the lead of creating what exactly they need to feel financially free, what exactly they need to make sure the systems are in place for them to be financially secure, for them to feel safe, and for them to be able to not only feel that for a moment, but to be able to feel that for a lifetime and throughout their healing journey. And so we really see survivors specifically that are not just being invited to the table to talk about these things and to talk about how to build collective power, but to actually be in the lead and creating that table and inviting other pillars of society to come along with them to figure out what exactly they need to move forward. It also involves collective voices with shared experiences that are coming together to bring change on the local as well as the federal level. So we all have a voice and we all are able to have experiences that really paint the picture of what exactly we need as survivors to be able to create change on so many different levels, whether they be on the community level, on the state level, or the federal level. And for some folks, what that means for them is to be able to do this through storytelling. I'm sure many of us that are on this webinar are able to understand how much powerful data and research can be when you connect that to an actual story. And through many or through all of our reports that we put out at FreeFrom, we do our best to really capture the voices of those that are the most marginalized groups, whether that be BIPOC folks, folks that are trans, system impacted, folks who are undocumented, to make sure that their stories are told. And most importantly, community building. Community building is so important to reduce that isolation so folks can feel that it's not just them having those experiences, and to be able to have that shared empathy. So all of these things really work together to create that survivor collective power, and for folks to see themselves as their own best resource and see that they are in the forefront of this movement. So I would like to ask folks and invite you to answer the question of, how do you feel you could support survivors in creating collective power? And if folks are comfortable, if you can type that into the chat box, if that is accessible to you, or if that is still disabled, if you can put it in the Q&A. So I'm seeing no forced exposure to faith for healing services, empowering them to have a voice, share their voice, sharing someone's own story to remind them that they're not alone, creating a platform to open it up for other survivors to speak up. Yes, yes. All of these are great answers and different ways that folks can really engage in collective power as a survivor. Oh, yes. Speaking up in places where conversations are avoided, and keeping the narrative that this is violence against people, period. Okay, and then I'm also seeing survivor groups, task forces, teaching speaking skills, all of these different things. And this last one that I want to read before I move on is, stop asking why didn't you leave, and start asking why are they abusive. Okay, so really looking at harm from different angles and making sure that blame isn't put on the individual that is receiving it. Thank you all for participating in that. Next slide, please. So one of the ways at FreeFrom that we are working towards building collective power for survivors is through our survivor-led peer-to-peer financial support groups. And we really created these groups because we knew that 99% of survivors were experiencing economic abuse. And we also knew about the isolation that is experienced on top of that. And so with thinking through that and thinking that all survivors may not feel comfortable with accessing services from a traditional intimate partner violence organization, that how could we create something where it is peer-to-peer led and where it is focused on community building. And so we created these peer-to-peer financial support groups that are led by survivors, and the survivors are coming together in a peer-to-peer setting, and they're focused on achieving financial freedom and building community while also sharing and receiving resources that are encouraging healing, safety, financial security, and overall well-being. We created these groups, and they were originally meant to be led in person. However, because of the pandemic, we created virtual meeting spaces that each group was able to have. And we wanted to have this to continue regardless of the pandemic taking place, because we saw how many incidents of intimate partner violence had skyrocketed because of the pandemic. And so we knew that we needed to continue on with this program. And we wanted it to also be something that was simple, and that all it took was a survivor to say, I am interested in working towards financial freedom. I am interested in being in a group with other survivors. And all they would have to do is let us know, and it would be 2 to 8 survivors within their own communities. And community can look different for different people. Your community could be your geographic community. It could also be a community that you've built online. It can be a community that you have built across different states. But whatever folks that you feel comfortable and brave and safe with, that are other survivors coming together and working towards that financial freedom. And the one thing that we constantly hear is folks saying that it feels good to have someone else that just gets it. You don't have to explain, this is why I have certain financial trauma. This is why my credit is the way it is. This is why I'm going through this litigation abuse with my past harm doer. But other folks that are also survivors are able to be there and get it and provide and offer support and resources. And so, as you see on the screen, folks would just contact me, let me know of their interest, and they would either let me know that they're interested in creating their own group, or perhaps they would like to be connected with other survivors, because again, I spoke about the isolation that's experienced. So we know that some folks may not know of other survivors, but they would still like to participate in this group. And so what we do is we would connect them based on their location, or even let's say they are in California and they want a group that is California wide as opposed to just LA focused. And something that we also do for the folks in the group is that we provide them with a guidebook. And the guidebook is over 200 pages of optional group discussions, activities, and resources. And this really helps to lay the groundwork and the foundation of the group as they are coming together to be vulnerable, as they're coming together to find out what do they need individually and what do they need from that group space on that journey towards financial freedom and healing. And so, as I mentioned, the groups are also survivor led. So we don't facilitate the groups, but the folks that are within the group, they decide who is going to facilitate each group meeting, and we check in with them. So if folks are interested and this sounds like something that you would be interested in, or you know of survivors that would be interested in this, then you can contact me and I can provide much more information about these groups and how we're looking at building collective power through peer-to-peer work. Okay, next slide, please. So with the program design of that specific group, some things that have really been spotlighted of how these groups have been successful is that they're very hands-off. We see survivors in the driver's seat that are participating in the group. We see ourselves that are in the passenger seat, or perhaps in the back seat or the car behind them. And what the reason that I use that analogy is because we see survivors that are driving the program. We see survivors as letting us know what they need differently so that we can continue to innovate. And so it actually feels like something that they can gain from. It's also very flexible. So folks that are participating in the program, they decide how often they're going to meet. They decide how long the meetings will be for. And also if they need to take a pause because they've had meeting fatigue. It's not a class, so it's not where they have a certain start and stop point, but we really want it to work for them. We really want to make sure we're meeting folks where they are at. It's also trusting survivors to navigate their healing and providing support along the way. And that trusting survivors is in bold because at FreeFrom, we really believe that's something that you have to do in this work. You have to make sure that that trust is there. And reaching all survivors, regardless if they are staying in a harmful situation or they're leaving, letting them know that this program is here for them, regardless of where they are in their healing journey. The groups are also offered nationwide. And so the groups can take place in whatever community that you're in throughout the United States. And again, continuously innovating to meet survivors where they are. Okay, next slide, please. So along with these groups, we knew that we needed to make sure we did more than just offer these peer-to-peer groups. We wanted to make sure that we started to create survivor-centered financial products. And two of those financial products is our savings matching program that we'll be launching next month, and our lending circles. So our savings matching program is a trust-based self-reporting program that eliminates common restrictions that can take place when survivors are saving through a program. So we're making sure that survivors, what they're doing is they're self-reporting how much they save each month, and we're not asking them to provide any type of paperwork. They don't need any type of identification. They only have to be a survivor. And we really wanted to make sure that this is centering them and making sure that it's motivating and trusting them and what they need. And so along with that, what we do is it's a 6-month long program, and we will match up to $40 a month for all of the folks that are participating. And we look at this as really creating a habit of saving. So beyond the program, that they're able to begin or continue to save. Another thing, as I mentioned, is our lending circles. And so with our lending circles, we're looking at social lending, and many folks may call it something different, but the social lending has taken place since forever. And it focuses on building credit in a community setting. It's 0% interest loans. It increases folks' credit scores and really works towards financial freedom and power. So we see these two products as really supporting survivors on their financial journey. Okay, next slide, please. One of our newest tools for survivors and for, folks that are working with survivors and just the communities, different communities at large, is our National Survivor Financial Security Map and Scorecard. We actually just launched that recently, and we'll go ahead and drop that in the chat if you would like to grab that from the chat to view it. And we hope that you do, but we're very excited that this specific tool will center financial security of survivors in each state. So really looking at what states are prioritizing survivors' financial security and creating different pathways for movement building with this specific tool. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll look at that a little deeper. So the map and scorecard offers accessible, plain language and information. That's something that we often hear from the folks that we work with, is they want something that is really accessible and it's not different jargon that they may not understand. I know even for myself, if it's not something that I'm familiar with, and I really need it to be broken down. So we do this to the best of our abilities with the map and scorecard. And so that information is about the laws in each state that impact survivors' ability to build and protect financial security. And then it's evaluating each state based on how well or poorly that they are supporting survivors' financial security, as well as providing model legislation and tailored state-specific recommendation for policy change. And so at the bottom, what you can see is that we have 0 states in the United States that are model states. We have 2 states that are practicing financial security friendly policies for survivors, 11 states that are taking steps to be more financially secure for survivors, 17 states with some accountability, and 21 states that are offering little accountability. And what we see with those numbers is really that there is opportunity for policy change and different opportunities for survivors to really get involved with their states, and even to look, perhaps they need to make a move and they want to see how are other states measuring up to the state that they're in currently, and how is this going to really support me as a survivor. Next slide, please. Okay, and so then when we're looking at building survivor political power, there's take action steps that are on this map and scorecard. So we have the contact your legislator to make it really easy. Folks are able to just plug in their address and their legislators will come up and they can contact them. And there's even sample text for them to be able to say, this is what they want that legislator to get behind. They want them to focus on the financial security of survivors or other issues that they're coming up against. There's also opportunities for to look at building collective survivor power with other survivors through different channels and partnering with FreeFrom. So if folks are saying, you know what, I'm a service provider or I'm belonging to a certain agency or in the political space, and I want to partner with FreeFrom to really work towards building survivor political power and their financial security, then they're able to find different options to do that and who to contact to do that. And the last thing is sharing of policy ideas. We really, really love this specific feature because we want to know, of course, we can come up with as many things that we would think survivors would need at FreeFrom, but we want to hear from others. We want to hear from the community, this ecosystem of support that we're creating for survivors, to hear what ideas they have. So I highly encourage you all to take a look at the map and scorecard. And again, we'll have that in the chat so you can directly be able to access that. Okay, next slide, please. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Amy to talk to us about our research.
Thanks so much, Em. And I always feel so energized and excited hearing you talk about the collective tower building work. So I love to follow that. All right, y'all, so excited to be here and chat with you today. Right now, I'm going to talk a little bit about our safety fund and implications beyond research. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. So what is the Survivor Safety Fund and why did we launch it? So as everyone on this call knows, in early spring of last year, when COVID came to the United States, came to our shores, really we saw incidences of DV skyrocketing. We saw incidences of unemployment skyrocketing. We were hearing that due to economic abuse, survivors were not able to access some of the financial resources they previously did have access to, like unemployment or paychecks. And then with the stimulus checks that started coming out. And so in April of 2020, we as a FreeFrom team sort of said, let's pause on what we're working on right now and think through how can we be really the most effective we can be in this moment for survivors? How can we be as responsive as we can and get folks what they really need? And we decided that we needed to get folks cash to spend as they saw fit, unrestricted cash. And so as you can see from this slide, in April of last year, we launched an open application for survivors to apply for a one-time, no strings attached cash grant. And we dispersed from April to June, 1,100 grants to survivors in 36 states and Puerto Rico, averaging $244 per grant. You can go to the next slide. And so what about the data we collected? What data did we collect and why did we collect it? And so of course, the number one primary goal of our safety fund was to get survivors cash so they could spend it as they saw fit and as they needed. But sort of as a secondary goal that appeared, we realized, wow, we have, we're in dialogue with all these folks from across the country and giving them this cash. Why don't we go ahead and see if we can ask some questions and get some data about what their financial situation is. And so what kind of data did we collect? Well, we asked survivors about what support they needed during COVID-19, what services they would like to receive from the domestic violence movement. And I'll get into this last bit in a little bit later, but also what survivors would like to see in a set of expanded systems of support. And we were gathering this data really to fill some gaps in knowledge. And specifically, we're talking about the full cost of economic abuse and the financial well-being of survivors. Go to the next slide. So what are some key takeaways from the data? Well, so the data we were able to collect represents more than 1,300 survivors from 36 states and Puerto Rico. Survivors range in age from 18 to 71 with an average age of 37. And folks who received grants represented a diverse range of genders, sexualities, and races and ethnicities. You can go on to the next slide. So we asked folks who received a grant from us to complete the CFPB's financial well-being scale, and the results were pretty staggering. So as you can see from this slide, the average score for survivors in our sample was 16 points lower than that of the average adult in the United States. Survivors on average were 4 times as likely as the average American adult to have experienced material hardship. So that means food insecurity or not being able to afford housing in the past year. And according to survivor scores in the well-being scale, they have on average less than $250 in savings. You can go to the next slide. We also gathered some information and data from survivors about how much economic abuse was actually costing them. And again, the results were pretty staggering. So as you can see from the slide, survivors reported on average that harm doers steal $1,280 from them every month. They also let us know and told us that harm doers restrict their freedom to spend an additional around $1,000 of their own money as they saw fit. That's on top of that $1,280 that they reported being stolen from them each month. On average, harm doers incur $15,936 in coerced or fraudulent debt in a survivor's name each year. Survivors reported on average losing out on $23,000 of income every year as a result of the intimate partner violence they were subjected to. And they reported incurring on average $17,770 in property damage costs every year. Go to the next slide. And so we also asked survivors, what do you need right now? What are your top needs? And here are the results here on this slide. The number one top need identified by survivors, which is 64% of survivors, was cash to spend as needed. The number one most urgent need folks identified. Following cash was utility bill relief at 41%, and then credit and debit relief at 35%. We also asked survivors, how much money do you need right now to get safe? And from the time we really opened up the application to the time we closed it, this number stayed pretty remarkably consistent. And the average is $730 is what we heard from survivors. And then we also asked folks to let us know how they spent their grant. So as everyone on this call is aware, giving unrestricted cash to survivors isn't necessarily the norm. And it really reveals kind of an uncomfortable truth, which is that we don't, as a society, really trust survivors to spend money in quote unquote the right ways. At FreeFrom, we don't think there is a right way for survivors to spend their money. Each individual is the best suited and knows their circumstances best to allocate their own resources. But we did ask folks to let us know how they spent their grant as a way that we think is a pretty powerful rebuttal to the argument that survivors don't know how to spend their cash the right way. So 55% of survivors spent their grants on food, 41% on household items, and then 40% on household utilities. Next. And I won't read through these verbatim. I'll let folks take a look. But some survivors shared their experiences. And I'll just say that, oftentimes, perhaps when someone spends money on something, from an outsider perspective, it might not seem that that expenditure is directly connected to staying safe. But as you can see here, folks shared with us that they used their grant for things like fixing a car that enabled them to move around in ways that they needed to avoid later costs like legal costs, et cetera. So it really just shows the transformative nature of direct cash assistance for survivors. And I think Tanya shared in the chat a link to our report called the Survivors Know Best report. All of this data and information is shared in that report. And I really encourage everybody to take a closer look at that because it's so full of even more data than we have time to share today. So just encourage you to take a look at the full report. Okay, you can go to the next slide. And so now we're really going to talk about why we should expand the ecosystem of support for survivors through systems change and what that looks like. And so one of the things that we learned through the safety fund process is that a majority of our grantees were not seeking services at a DV or SA organization when they applied for a grant from us. So as you can see from this slide, in fact, 71% of folks who got a grant from us were not seeking services at a domestic violence or sexual assault organization when they applied for the grant. And as you can see here, survivors who identified as women were 2 times as likely to be seeking services from a DVSA org as survivors who don't identify as women. Heterosexual survivors were more than 3 times as likely to be seeking services from a DVSA org as were queer survivors, and only 17% of Indigenous survivors were seeking services from a DVSA org compared to 31% of survivors who do not identify as Indigenous. And so what does this really mean? Well, while DV and SA orgs are and will always remain essential to supporting survivors and getting them access to life-saving resources and support, they aren't sufficient. And we have to really meet survivors where they are. And so where are survivors? What are the other access points? Or put another way, what does an effective and accessible expanded ecosystem of support for survivors look like? Well, with 1 in 4 women and 1 in 2 trans folks experiencing intimate partner violence in the United States today, every employer employs survivors. Every bank has survivor account holders. Every credit card company has survivor credit card holders. And so if you name an institution, they are employing and serving survivors. And so these institutions have both a responsibility and a huge opportunity to help survivors build and protect the financial security they need for long-term safety. And so as part of our safety fund, we ask survivors about their experience with these societal institutions to get a sense of whether such an expanded ecosystem of support would actually work for them, and if they'd even want to seek support outside of the DV movement. And I'm going to share a little bit about what they told us. So as you can see from this slide, we asked survivors, okay, what about employers? Tell us about your experience with employers. And so 70% of survivors indicated that they had never sought support from an employer as a survivor. Of those who had sought support, 59% reported that they received either no help or the support that they received was unhelpful. But, and this is my favorite number on these slides, is this bottom number, 47% said that they would seek support if they knew services and support for survivors were available. And we've got to assume that this number would just increase as employers started offering explicit support. So this bottom number really represents the incredible opportunity that employers have to start supporting survivors and building and protecting their financial security. So you can go on to the next slide. And what would this look like? What are some immediate steps that employers could take to support survivors? Here are just a couple actionable recommendations. So implement a survivor paid leave policy so survivors have access to the leave they need to address the consequences of abuse without losing a paycheck or risking losing their job. Create a savings matching plan for employees. Facilitate peer groups to foster community amongst staff. Start an emergency fund to cover expenses and payroll and emergencies. Create a flexible schedule and working environment for folks. Cover the cost of childcare. Offer health insurance to all employees and allow low-cost addition of family members. These are all easy, actionable ways that today employers could start better supporting their staff that are being subjected to intimate partner violence. You can go to the next slide. So we also asked survivors about credit card companies. And perhaps unsurprisingly, 76% of survivors reported that they had never sought support from a credit card company. Of survivors who had sought support from their credit card company, 69% said that they either received no help or that the support that they did receive was unhelpful. And we're back to my favorite number on the slide again, this number that represents opportunity, and that is that 48% of survivors said that they would seek support from their credit card company if they knew that that support existed and was offered. And again, that number is just going to go up as credit card companies start offering explicit support. We can go to the next slide. So what does this look like? What actionable steps and immediate steps could credit card companies take today to start better supporting their survivor customers? You can see these that we have here. These are just a few, but accept proof beyond police reports or court orders to establish coerced or fraudulent debt. We've heard already in this presentation that a majority of survivors are in fact afraid to call the police. And so if you require a police report to access resources, you're automatically really excluding a lot of survivors from that support. Offer skip a payment options for survivors. Forgive all or a portion of coerced or fraudulent debt. That debt wasn't incurred by the survivor in the first place. Offer pay what you can flexible repayment programs. Freeze reports of missed or late payments on coerced or fraudulent debt to credit reporting agencies for 6 months. And as we all know on this call, we've already talked about it, damaged credit has such far-reaching implications for folks here in the United States. And so really offering survivors relief from credit damage is very important in helping them build that financial security that they need for long-term safety. Train employees in economic abuse and designate an internal team within the credit card company to handle survivors' accounts. And then finally, implement enhanced fraud protections on survivors' accounts to offer more protections against coerced and fraudulent debt. Sure, apologies, I'm going to slow down a little bit. I have a tendency to speak a little too fast. Okay, we also asked survivors about banks, and 75% of survivors reported that they never sought support from a bank as a survivor. Of the survivors who said they had sought support from a bank, 64% said that the help that they received was either unhelpful or they just didn't receive any help at all. And we're back to my favorite number, which is the number that really represents the opportunity here. And that is that 51% of survivors said that they would seek support from their bank if they knew that that sort of support was available. And so what are some things? Oh, sorry, let's take a pause right here. You can go back, please. Back a couple. And there's just a question, a reflection question for y'all, which is, what are some of the banking related challenges that the folks you work with or you yourself have experienced as a survivor? Does anybody want to share? Anybody want to share banking related challenges? Anybody? Okay, I'm going to keep moving on, but please feel free to either put this information in the chat or add it to the Q&A. The chat's still not working. And so it looks like the PowerPoint, we might be troubleshooting something with that, and that's totally okay, because I can keep moving on. So what are some things that banks could do, immediate actions, next steps that banks could take to start supporting their customers being subjected to, oh yes, not being able to get a person off an account. But what are some actual immediate steps right now that banks can take to better support their customers that are being subjected to intimate partner violence? So we are asking banks to implement our set of 11 survivor safety banking guidelines. And basically what these are is guidelines that we put together in partnership with survivors from across the country, as well as international experts from some countries that are already doing this work, to really, these guidelines, when implemented, would immediately take steps to better support survivor customers. And I actually have my PowerPoint up here, so I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, here you go. We're flexible here at FreeFrom. Okay, so here we go. All right, so here we go. We're talking about our survivor safety banking guidelines. And I'm not going to go through each and every guideline right now, but you can take a look at this slide to see what those are. And these numbers in red at the, in parentheses, the percentage numbers, we actually went back to survivors after we developed these guidelines and said, would these guidelines even be helpful for you? And so what you see are the percentage of survivors that responded that each particular guideline would be helpful for them in building financial security and protecting that financial security. So as you can see, survivors overwhelmingly said, yes, please, my bank, please implement these guidelines because they absolutely would help me in building financial security. And so in the same vein, what immediate steps can the federal government take to support survivors while they bank? Well, we are going to be asking the federal government to pass the Survivor Safety Banking Act. And this is a piece of federal legislation that we put together modeled after the Senior Safe Act, which really dealt with how financial institutions can support their elder customers and protect them from elder financial exploitation. So we're using that successful act as a model here. And this act would require financial institutions to train their management and staff on how to detect, prevent, and respond to economic abuse in the bank, and report suspected cases of economic abuse, and do some other things that would really, as I've been mentioning, help survivors better protect their assets when they're in the bank. Okay. And so I am going to turn it over. Actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to put this back up. I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Tanya. And Tanya, I can advance the slides for you.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for hanging in there with us through all the tech issues. I really, really appreciate y'all. All right, so let's talk about building capacity in the movement and investing in staff. So what does this mean? So we at FreeFrom have learned that 1 in 2 of all service providers working in the movement are survivors themselves. Sorry, yeah, stay there. And when we talk about building capacity, we're talking about building their knowledge, their confidence, their own financial their own financial situation so that they can actually support and show up completely to do financial work with the survivors that they support. And why do we do this? So next slide, please. So here in Los Angeles and well, we did a little study here in LA and in Orange County that's coming out next month, very exciting. And what we learned is that the average salary for a person working in the gender-based violence movement, sorry, I just realized I was talking really fast, so let me slow down. I get excited with this, was $37,500 per year for both management and non-management positions. So to give you an idea, a living wage for a single parent with 2 children in Los Angeles is closer to $78,000 a year. So what this means is that there is a huge gap between what folks are getting paid in the gender-based violence, the funding available to pay folks in this movement well, and the actual living wage. So these are jobs that require a lot of physical and emotional labor, yet most service providers report being overworked and underpaid. And it's not that they don't love their jobs. A lot of us love our jobs and continue to do it, even when we know the pay is not the best. But just because we're doing this because it's our soul work or because we're our survivors ourselves does not mean that we don't deserve living wages. Next slide, please. So I already mentioned this, 1 in 2 of service providers report having lived experience with gender-based violence. And an even more interesting stat that we found was that of those who were comfortable sharing with us the nuances in their experiences, 2 out of 3 experienced economic abuse or were still actively experiencing economic abuse. Next slide. And when we asked, what do you need to be able to support the survivors that you work with on different financial capacities, service providers told us that the biggest barriers to doing financial work with survivors was, number 1, lack of funding to do this work. So the gender-based violence movement, the IPV movement, is one of the most underfunded movements in the nation. Lack of financial security for themselves. So a lot of service providers told us, it's hard for me to do this work because I am not financially secure myself. I am still recovering from the harm that I was subjected to. And it's difficult for me to start doing this work with the folks I support. And then the last one was lack of training and resources. So there isn't really a lot of training to support staff members who want to start doing more financial support work with survivors. Next slide. And I think it's important to talk about, why aren't we talking about this? Why are we not talking about our own experiences, our own financial challenges in the movement? And then again, if we're not talking about it, then we're probably going to have a really hard time talking about it with the folks that we support. So why do we fear or avoid financial conversations? For some people, this feels too scary, too personal, too challenging. There are many different cultural beliefs around money. So for example, a lot of people grew up being told money is a private matter. You don't talk about it. Similar to, domestic violence or IPV, you don't talk about it, right? It's a private matter. So who am I to tell someone anything about money? So we get that a lot, right? So I'm not financially secure myself. Who am I to support somebody? Who am I to know anything about this? So that's a lot of confidence, lack of confidence around finances. So it's hard to talk about it with other people. Our own financial traumas. So if we are survivors, it's very likely that we experienced economic abuse and therefore we have financial trauma. Lack of funding to do this work. Like I mentioned, there's not a lot of funding to do domestic violence work as it is. So doing the nuance of financial work within the domestic violence field, the funding there is even more limited. And then lack of training. So it's hard to get comfortable with financial conversations if we're not really getting training, we're not really getting resources about how to do this. Next slide. But what are we missing when we avoid money talk? Economic abuse can continue to go unnoticed and get worse. So for example, let's say someone comes to your agency and you are a shelter or transitional housing provider. During that whole time, maybe they're not earning income or they're struggling to find a job. Maybe that whole time, the harm doer is still racking up debt or using the credit cards of that person while they're at that shelter and struggling to find a job or income. So therefore, their credit is going to get worse during that time, right? If nobody is asking, nobody is talking about it, then it can get worse and it can go unnoticed. We're also missing opportunities for economic growth. We all have economic aspirations and goals, or maybe don't even know where to start. So when we don't start talking about them, we miss those opportunities to grow in this space. Inequalities around money go unnoticed and unchecked. So this is more in our workplaces, right? So if we are uncomfortable talking about our salaries, how do we know if maybe another coworker who maybe is a man or maybe is white is getting paid more than us for doing the same work? Or how do we know if you know, maybe we're all struggling to get our paychecks or we're not getting paid overtime? So all these inequalities around money go unnoticed and unchecked when we avoid those conversations in the workplace. And then we also are missing opportunities to heal financial trauma. So again, like all trauma, it's sometimes some of us want to focus on healing those traumas and really understanding them so that we can move on and really be able to focus on, you know, creating the life that we want and the financial security that we want in the future. So again, all of this creates long-term economic security. So if we're missing, avoiding, scared, that's completely valid. Again, we all have different financial traumas that make money hard or money conversations hard, but ultimately talking about them really helps us all create long-term economic security. Next slide. So one way that FreeFrom is supporting agencies in the IPV movement is through our Survivor Wealth and Wellness Certification and Training Program. Next slide. So as you all know, people want training. So we created a training. It's called the Survivor Wealth and Wellness Certification and Training Program, which works to integrate financial capacity building into the gender-based violence movement by investing in staff. So we really believe that in order for us to be able to do this work with the survivors that we serve, we, the staff working in the movement, need to be confident in our own financial position and need to feel supported and need to have access to the same healing services that we often give our clients, but not ourselves. So this training is a virtual training that offers an online classroom paired with financial coaching for each staff member so that that staff member has someone that can support them with their own financial goals, like paying off debt, asking for a raise, working on their credit, so on and so forth. So they have a FreeFrom coach who can work with them individually on that. And then in the classroom, they're learning, you know, how do you have trauma-informed financial conversations? How do you talk to a survivor about checking their credit score? How do you start reporting fraudulent debt to the credit bureaus, so on and so forth? How do you start talking to banks about economic abuse, stuff like that? So it's really a holistic approach that invests in the staff first and foremost in their own knowledge and their own confidence and their own financial goals and financial well-being. And really, this is what we're seeing help agencies to really focus on doing the same thing with their clients. It's hard to do it with your clients when you haven't really given yourself the space to explore these things, learn these things, and also heal some of that economic trauma. Next slide. So there are many other ways to work with FreeFrom, and I dropped our next webinar in the chat. It's our creating survivor-centered workplaces. So some of the stuff that Amy was mentioning about how employers could be more helpful and support survivors is of interest to you, then I definitely recommend going to that. But these are all the other ways that you can work with us. So if you have questions about our safety fund, how we distributed that money, how we fundraised it, how we got organized. Our teammate Diana is the best person for that. If you want to learn more about survivor-centered workplaces, come to our webinar. Amy will also be there. You can reach out to Amy. If you are a staff member in an IPB agency, then you can also talk to me. If you want to support survivor wealth policy, or you're curious about our map and scorecard, you can talk to Sabrina. The survivor wealth and wellness certification is me, so you can talk to me. I also do anything related to training for the IPB movement and other nonprofits who are wanting to do more financial work with survivors. If you are interested in our peer-to-peer financial support groups, you can talk to M. And if you want help with navigating or seeking compensation for the harm that you have been subjected to, or that a survivor that you're working with has been subjected to, you can check out our compensation compass, which is a great tool for you to really understand what are the legal avenues to compensation based on the harm and the experience that each survivor has had all over the nation. Next slide. So let's jump into some Q&A. So somebody in the chat earlier mentioned, how can you engage and like a message out some of the data that we are putting out? These are all our social media handles. We have really great little pictures and posts about all the different reports and data that we collect that you can easily share. So definitely check us out, follow us. And our emails are here. But besides that, let's jump into some questions. Any questions that we can get started with?
So Tanya, I wanted to see if you could highlight a question from earlier that you answered in the chat box. It was talking about how you manage this on a team level. It was writing the content, design, all of the documents that M had mentioned earlier. I think that would be great to highlight for folks.
Yeah, do you want to answer that one, since I answered it for you while you were talking?
And which document specifically?
In the guidebook.
Okay, so you're speaking about the
So add this question.
I'm sorry?
I think it was this question about how do you manage creating the guidebook and all the stuff that you do with the peer folks.
Okay, so the way that we created the guidebook.
Yes.
Okay, just wanted to make sure I understood it correctly. Okay, so the way that we did create the guidebook is that we did it as a team. So I was the lead on that creation, but we made sure that we created it with a trauma-informed lens and making sure that it was survivor-centered. And the way that we start with really looking at abundance and looking at the financial life journey of a survivor. So at the end of the guidebook, it talks about retirement and talks about wills and end-of-life planning and things like that. But we had formal time that we put together for the team to really review every section within the guidebook, every activity, every group discussion, to make sure that we all were on board to putting this content out and knowing that it was something that folks could be able to thrive from. It's also, so what the other thing that I'll add is that we'll be holding focus groups this year, later on in the fall, where we'll be asking folks what they enjoyed about the guidebook, what changes they would like to be made, how we can innovate even more. And so we're constantly collecting information, so it's more of a living document that can be changed. We provide physical copies that we mail out to group members, and we also have a PDF copy as well that folks receive. Hopefully answer the question.
Yeah, and I just wanted to follow up with what I feel like would be a good follow-up is how do you have any advice for folks who may be trying to start their own peer-to-peer groups in their state or their community or within their program? What words of advice do you have for them?
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you so much. So if folks are interested in starting their own group, what I would say is first begin by thinking if you have 2 to 8 other survivors that you're in community with, that you would like to be a part of this group. And then you can contact me And it looks on the screen that my contact information isn't showing right now. So if if Amy or Tanya could drop that in the chat, and you can contact me and let me know that you're interested, and I will provide folks with outreach materials. So if you were reaching out to them via social media or through an email exchange or even through text, that you would have the language that you can use and make your own, so that it really relates to the way that you would be speaking to folks about the group. And I also provide a flyer for folks and follow-up information. And one thing that I will add is that we do collect the email addresses and the mailing addresses of folks that are participating in the group. And the email addresses are so that we can, so that I can be able to be in contact with them throughout the program. And also the mailing addresses are so that we can send out that starter pack that has the guidebook and some other materials. And folks can use any name that they would like. We make sure that everything is really kept in a confidential space and only accessible to the FreeFrom team.
Thanks, Em. And I think, Amy, a question that you got when you were talking about the ecosystem of support was, how does a survivor start to have these conversations with those businesses? Sometimes survivors aren't wanting to share their story yet.
Sure, absolutely. It's a great question. And I think just as a general matter, the way that we sort of think about these issues is that one part of the reason that folks are worried or anxious or scared to disclose, for example, to an employer, is because the being subjected to an partner violence is still so stigmatized, right? And so part of our work with employers, with banks, with credit card companies, et cetera, is really to help support them in creating and implementing these explicit policies that support survivors to work on that, starting to destigmatize that. So, once survivors see that their employer, for example, is saying, we are offering paid and protected leave that doesn't take away from your accrued vacation, that doesn't take away from your accrued sick leave. Once those kind of policies are in place, the hope is that more folks will feel more comfortable coming forward. And so that's a conversation, and that's a conversation we have with our employer partners, because we kind of hear that question from them too. What if folks aren't comfortable in disclosing? And our response really is, well, you have to be intentional about making them feel more comfortable. And so that's not a direct answer to your question, but I think that's how we work on the destigmatization from the institutional perspective. They have a responsibility to make people feel comfortable and to create the space for folks to feel like they can come forward. As far as, what are some steps, or how could survivors as individuals kind of go to, for example, their bank or their credit card company or their employer and say, I want you to implement some of these supportive policies. I think we're working on creating spaces and tools for survivors to work as a collective. That's part of our systems change work. So as we're creating these actionable recommendations for institutions, we're also going to be creating space and resources and tools for survivors to easily advocate for some of these changes at their bank, at their credit card company, at their employer. So I would say stay tuned and follow our work for some more information on those pieces. And we always are trying to provide data. Data is so important to all of the work we do here at FreeFrom, and we really believe that having this very survivor-centered data, it's literally data that we're gathering directly from folks who are impacted, is going to be helpful in making the case to some of these institutions that not only is this a problem that exists, but it's a problem that these institutions are responsible for helping solve. Hopefully that sort of answered the question, but I'm happy to answer any follow-ups or say anything more that could be helpful.
Thanks, Amy. Another question I see in the chat is, I think, a question, I'm not sure who to direct this to, but someone from the FreeFrom, I'm sure, can answer, for the FreeFrom team. Is FreeFrom engaging with other...
Oh, no, sorry.
Is FreeFrom engaging with other unconditional direct cash pilots or networks to help scale up survivor-centered cash assistance, Or is there any legislative advocacy being done to support existing cash assistance proposals for survivors?
Yes, is the answer to that question. And actually, Miriam, you could speak to this as well. But the Biden-Harris administration, as part of its plan to end violence against women, made a pledge, an explicit pledge of $5 billion to be used as direct cash assistance for survivors. And then in their most recent budget, I think said something like 250 million or something like that. But the point is, there have been explicit pledges made by the Biden-Harris administration that they're going to use some direct cash, they're going to fund direct cash assistance for survivors. So really what we see from FreeFrom's perspective as sort of our role is to try to work with others in the movement, work with others in other movements. Direct cash is something that is transformative and helpful, not only for survivors, but for a lot of folks going through a lot of different experiences. And so working with folks within the movement, working with cross-sector, other organizations, folks that are doing anti-poverty work, folks that are doing anti-homelessness work, folks that are doing asset building work, to really create momentum for these resources and to really mobilize survivors who have received the support and understand from firsthand experience how incredibly transformative it is and how helpful it is for them to get and stay safe, to really mobilize folks to create a movement for direct cash assistance for survivors. And so, if that's something that you want to be more plugged into and you want to get more updates about and hear how that's going, what you can do to support, please feel free to reach out to me. Happy to chat with people in more detail about that. But it does feel like it's on us as advocates to really hold the Biden-Harris administration accountable to the promises they've made in this realm. And of course, we're very excited to see it, right? Because it's really the first time that an administration has made such a pledge. So we just want to make sure that we're holding folks accountable to the ways they've promised to support survivors.
Thank you so much, Amy. So another great question that I actually know that you all have social media posts about is, what is FreeFrom's advocate pay as base model?
I can take that one. So we don't call ourselves advocates, even though I think we all do advocacy at different levels, but our salaries start at $65,000 a year. And the reason for that is because we looked at the living wage here in Los Angeles and make sure that our salaries match that. So we'll talk more about that at our upcoming survivor-centered workplaces webinar. We're really going to use a lot of the examples of the benefits, the policies, the practices that FreeFrom uses, how we got there. So I really encourage you to come and watch that if you're interested in learning more about that.
Thank you. So another super specific question that I think is going to go back to Amy. This is a very specific question on your banking recommendations number 7, using alternative IDs and addresses. We showed this document to our banking partner and we're told this was not possible because of the Patriot Act banking requirements. Have you experienced similar pushback, or do you have any recommendations for federal policy changes around this?
This is a really great question. And in fact, yes, so to say a little bit more about our banking guidelines, and apologies, I feel like I was pulling up my PowerPoint, and so I kind of missed some of the good pieces of data, et cetera, to say a little bit more about these guidelines. So just to take a couple steps back before I get into the answer to this question, we have learned through our survivor network, from our survivor network, that 48% of survivors in our network indicated that a harm doer had accessed, controlled, or withdrawn from their online bank account. 48%. So that means 48% of folks didn't have a safe way to save money. And obviously that's extraordinarily problematic to on the pathway to building the financial security you need for safety. We have heard from survivors about having to hide cash around their homes, for example, to try to start saving that money they need. And so that is sort of one of the driving kind of problems that is behind our banking guidelines, and the need, as we see it, to really bring banks in as part of the solution to disrupting the cycle of intimate partner violence in the United States. And so getting back to the question, that number 7 guideline, it says, and I can actually go back really quickly so we can take a look at it. But the number 7 guideline is to allow survivors to open accounts with ID and address alternatives. And 77% of survivors indicated that this would be helpful to them. As everyone on the call, or most people probably already are aware, when folks have to leave quickly from a situation, they often have to leave behind identifying documents, including driver's license, passports, birth certificates, and they oftentimes don't have a permanent address of where they're going to go next. And so this was one of our suggestions to banks. And yes, we did hear back from banks whom we pitched these guidelines to, like, know your customer regulations are going to make this really difficult, the Patriot Act piece that you referred to. Interestingly, though, we are aware of some other like very specific programs that in some branches in certain locations will allow sort of like a temporary ID or something like that in certain situations. So we're getting kind of conflicting information, but by and large, that is what we're hearing back from banks. Our kind of approach is really to work closely with the CFPB. They put out some really amazing guidance for how banks could support their elder customers and protect them from elder financial exploitation a few years ago. And we found that after the CFPB put out that really rich and robust guidance to banks, 5 years later, most banks in the United States are implementing the changes that were recommended by the CFPB for elder customers. So we want to kind of emulate that success. And one of the things we're working with the CFPB on is, what can we do here? What kind of guidance can we give to financial institutions so that they can create programs like this? Because allowing a survivor to open a bank account without, in the moment, a permanent ID doesn't run afoul of the purpose of these Know Your Customer laws, which is to prevent fraud. So our approach really is to work with regulators so that we can help create guidance that will then give financial institutions the peace of mind they need to start offering protections like this.
Thank you so much, Amy. So something else that I thought, Tanya, you maybe want to elaborate on is there was a comment about how some policies state that you cannot discuss wages with other coworkers. That can make it even more of a fear-based position to start a conversation from. So do you have any creative ideas on how to address this, or maybe just normalize talking about wages?
Yeah, I think for me, it's a little concerning that is a policy to begin with. Like, why? My question is why? Why is that a policy? So maybe asking, why is this a policy, and maybe what's the intention behind it? If there isn't an intention behind it or a good explanation, then it might help whoever created that really, audit their policies and think about, is this harmful or is this useful? I know something that we've done in our training network. So for our training network is agencies who have signed up for our Survivor Wealth and Wellness Training and Certification Program, is we've started support groups amongst staff who are at different agencies and working on, asking for better salaries, asking for better benefits, asking for better working conditions, so they can start supporting each other. So similar to the work that Emma's doing with survivors, we're kind of borrowing some of that and starting to do it with service providers, because we are not the experts in all of it. Y'all are the experts, and your own agencies, how they work, what works for them. But sometimes really finding allies at your agency who you can connect with, who you can have these conversations with, really strategize about, how can we, maybe write a letter to leadership, or how can we maybe ask for a meeting with HR to talk about some changes in our employee handbook or whatever it may be. So really beginning to share best practices amongst each other, and just, you know, finding those allies at your workplace that you do feel comfortable talking about money, and growing that from there, and really thinking about, you know, how might our leadership at our agency listen to us. And unfortunately, you know, not all leaders are going to listen. But we are thinking about creating a little template letter so that folks can start using it and sending it and using it with their leadership and sending it out. And we'll have more resources, and Amy can probably share a little bit more about that too.
Yes, thanks, Tanya, and thank you for those pieces. And I just wanted to jump in and add a little bit about sort of coming at this issue from working directly with employers and talking to employers about how they can create survivor-centered workplaces and have good supportive policies. And I think part of that conversation is, you know, take a look at your policies and think about how they could potentially be mirroring abuse, right? Mirroring economic abuse. So when we think about, oh, you know, and I'm very familiar. I used to work in a not FreeFrom, of course, but I used to work at an institution that had that policy. Like, you shouldn't tell people how much you make. We don't want you to talk to people about raises or bonuses. And when you think about that's mirroring some abusive tactics, right? Like controlling, you know, your knowledge, right? Your relevant knowledge about the financial situation. And so also it's about going to employers and having those kinds of conversations with them. Like, take a step back, look at your policies. How could some of these be mimicking the economic abuse that survivors are experiencing as part of their abusive relationship? And basically, you know, I sort of assuming the best, right? We don't think that you want to be mirroring these abusive tactics. So let's talk about how you can move out of that and be more supportive. And part of that is going to be have transparency about salaries, have transparency about how you're making those decisions. And in fact, that's going to create a more open workplace with happier employees, no matter what, you know, beyond folks who are being actively subjected to intimate partner violence. So I would just wanted to add that, you know, the way that we're kind of framing that as well is, employers, this is on you. You know, this is your responsibility.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you so much, Em. Thank you so much, Tanya. I see no other questions in the chat. So as the policy director of the National Domestic Violence Hotline, I can give a personal review of working with FreeFrom. I give it a 10 of 10. So should you have any qualms about working with them, I definitely recommend diving in. So just to close us out, I know you covered so much content. Some of it can get heavy. So Tanya and Amy, what is the one thing you are going to do to take care of yourself today that you're going to share with us?
Oh, I love that question. I'm going to go first because I'm going to do this right after we sign off. I'm going to take my dogs on a nice walk through the neighborhood.
I'll go ahead and go next. I'm going to nourish my body with a good meal.
Yeah, it's lunchtime over here and it's way too hot in LA to cook. So I'm going to order myself some yummy food and eat it in the AC.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much again, Tanya and Amy. You have FreeFrom's contact information up on the main page. The hotline will be posting a recording of the webinar, as well as emailing a link to all the attendees. I'm sure that we could post all of the great links in the description. And thank you again for joining us today. We're so excited to just be able to lift up the fantastic work that FreeFrom is doing. And I know that there are many ways to find us, so please be in touch if we can ever be of service to you. Thanks again, everyone.